we're now going to cover a little bit of research methods. Not a whole lot. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth. You can take a whole class on research methods, and if you're a psychology major, you will have to anyway. So I'm just going to kind of give you an overview of it here, just so you know about the science of developmental psychology. So first off, as I said in the last lecture, we are now in the movement of child development that uses the scientific method. You should know what the scientific method is already, so I'm just going to go through it briefly. Depending on where you look, the steps of the scientific method may be a little different, but the general form remains the same. So here's how the scientific method works. The first step is to form a research question. What do you want to know? For example, Piaget, a theorist who we'll cover extensively, wanted to know why children were choosing the wrong answers on intelligence tests. That was his research question. That's what he wanted to study. Second step, do background research. This is a very important step that is often overlooked. Don't start from scratch. See what others before you have done. What did they find? What were their variables? What were the limitations of their study? And you use that background research as a jumping off point to start your own research. After you've done that background research, and it's important that you do that first, you develop a hypothesis. This should be based on that background information. A hypothesis, if you remember, is an informed guess or an educated guess. It is not a theory. In terms of science, theory and hypothesis do not mean the same thing. Theories are developed after many tests and many conclusions. They're based on a lot of evidence. A hypothesis is just an educated guess based on your background research. The next step is to test your hypothesis. This step is very involved and is not nearly as simple as it seems. You want to make sure that your test is measuring the variables you want to measure while eliminating variables you don't want to measure. We'll talk more about this step in a bit because it's probably the most extensive step. Next, you draw conclusions. What did your test tell you? Was your hypothesis supported? Why or why not? Then the last step is to report your findings. This is another very important and often overlooked step. Science can't advance if scientists don't share their findings. Many people feel they should only share findings if they have significant results, but this is not true. You should share your findings even if you don't find something. That lack of a relationship may inform the next person who has a similar question and may lead them to find something, may lead them to do something different. If you don't report your findings, science can't advance and all of your effort was useless. So here's a diagram showing the scientific method. So again, basic steps remain the same. Ask a question, form a hypothesis, perform an experiment, analyze your data, create your conclusion. If your hypothesis was supported, you go back here and you perform another experiment to see if it's supported again. And again, can you repeat your results? Can you do it in a slightly different way? Okay, how much can your hypothesis relate in different circumstances? Down here, if your hypothesis is not supported, then you go back here and you construct a new hypothesis based on what you've learned, and you go through the steps again. The important thing about this diagram is the cycle. The heart of the scientific method is that it never ends. Every cycle should contribute something to the field, answering some questions and creating new ones. That's the beauty of the scientific method. It is always creating new questions for the next researcher to take, or for you to take and refine your hypothesis or find a new one. So that's the scientific method in a nutshell, and we do follow it in psychology. Psychology is a science. Okay, so you've come up with a hypothesis, tested it, and drawn conclusions. So now what? Well, you publish. Remember, report your results. We're going to go through what a scientific article looks like. You're probably going to have to read some of these if you're a psychology major, so it's important you understand kind of how they go. First off, you see an abstract. This is the summary of the article. In a paragraph or two, it tells you what the study was trying to find, how they approached it, what they found, and a brief interpretation. So it's just the summary of the article. It's like the blurb on the back of a book. The point of an abstract is to let you know if the article is what you're looking for before you read the whole thing. Next is the introduction. This should tell you what the point of the research is, what the hypothesis is, and it contains a literature review of the previous findings. It tells you what else they have found in their field that contributes to their research question. The next section is the method. This is where they tell you their participants, who they used for the study, their ages, their demographics, how they were recruited. It also tells you what they did. What measures did they use? How did they use them? Was there a control group? Their method should be detailed enough that someone could go out there and replicate their study exactly. Okay, so it has to tell you all the steps of their experiment or their study. The next section would be the results. This is what was found. It's usually expressed through statistics, then interpreted. So this is where you would have tables or graphs. But I need to give you a brief caveat about statistical significance. When you read articles, they'll tell you a result was significant or not significant. But whether or not something gets statistical significant is heavily influenced by the number of participants they had. So if a study had 500 participants, they're almost certainly going to be significant no matter what. But if a study only had 15 participants, they're going to have a really hard time getting statistical significance. So this means if a study had a large group, they're more likely to get significant results, but those results may not be very meaningful. That's why some articles will also report something called an effect size, which isn't influenced by the size of the sample. Don't worry about this too much for this class. It's not going to be really important. I'm just trying to get it into your brain a little bit, because you will need this later. Then the last section of an article is the discussion. This tells you what the results meant. How did the study tie into the studies of the introduction? Did it agree with previous findings? Did it disagree? What were the limitations of the study? What should be done next? What are the new questions that should be asked? This is where they tell you where to go next in that scientific method cycle. And that's everything that's in an article. So now we're going to talk about different ways for people to collect data. So how do they find all these things out? The first is a naturalistic observation. We talked about this already a little bit with Darwin. That's what he did for his baby biographies. Okay, you just observe something the way it recurs. There's no measuring, there's no manipulating. You don't interact with participants, you just watch and take notes. This is how a lot of the theorists will study, such as Bowlby and Piaget did their work, just observing children and keeping very good logs of what happened. Another form is a case study. This is observing just one or very few participants. You can go into depth with just one person. This is used in a lot of clinical settings, especially when the person has a rare condition that you just can't get enough participants for. You can do a case study. If you look up the story of Jeannie, she would be a case study, because for ethical or other reasons, there may not be a way to get a big participant pool for whatever you're trying to study. So a case study is a way to examine one person who has what you're looking for. But it's hard to draw broad conclusions when you're just observing one person. Next form is a survey. This just means a set of measurements from a sample of more participants than a case study. So you usually have a lot of participants in a survey. It could involve questionnaires, interviews, or other kinds of tests or measures. So a survey is a collection of tests. It gives you more data and you're better able to draw conclusions because you have more participants. So a correlational study versus an experiment. First, a little bit of review. A variable is just something that varies. It's what you're interested in studying. It's something that can change. The first type of variable is an independent variable. This is the variable that you are manipulating. It's the cause of a cause and effect question. For example, in the question, does gamification increase student motivation? Gamification is the independent variable because I can change it. It's what I am manipulating. The dependent variable is your outcome or your effect. It's what you think changes based on the independent variable. You don't manipulate this one, you just measure it based on the independent variable. So in our question, student motivation is the dependent variable. So a correlational study just looks at pre-existing relationships. There's no manipulation of variables whatsoever. You probably can't control which group participants go into. You're just looking at what already exists to see if you can find a relationship between variables. Psychology uses these a lot because many of our variables of interest can't be manipulated ethically. For example, if you're looking into the effects of child abuse on development, you can't manipulate the child abuse condition. You can't assign children to abuse conditions. If you're interested in attachment, you can't assign babies to different parenting styles. You just have to look at what is already there. The opposite of this is the experiment. This involves a manipulation of variables. Now you can have an independent and a dependent variable. And ideally you have random assignment, so your participants are put into groups randomly. Everyone in your study has an equal chance of being in all of your groups. And preferably you have also random selection, which means you have a pool of participants that you randomly choose who goes into your study. But in psychology, random selection isn't very common. But we try to do random assignment whenever we can. A quasi-experiment is a mixture of a correlational study and an experiment. Essentially, you can control some things, but not all of them. You can manipulate the independent variable, but you can't randomly assign your participants to groups. For instance, if you were looking at different teaching styles for the same class, you might measure or compare test scores of one class to another, but you weren't able to assign which students went into which class. So you are kind of looking at an independent-dependent variable, but you didn't control where your participants went. That would be a quasi-experiment. An important part of an experiment is a control group. You should have one whenever you can. This is opposed to the treatment group. So a control group is a group that has no treatment. So in my example about gamification, I would measure two classes. I would use gamification with one class, and I wouldn't use it with the other class. The one without it would be my control group. The control group is very important to include whenever possible to help ensure that it's your independent variable causing the change in your dependent variable and not something else that you're not measuring. Positive and negative correlation. When you're looking for a relationship between variables, you will often find a statistic called a correlation. Correlations are just relationships, and they can be positive or negative, but that doesn't mean good or bad. Positive and negative is more in the mathematical sense. So I'm going to take you all the way back to algebra, which I'm sure was your favorite subject in high school. So there are three possibilities when looking for a correlation. The first, as shown by the first graph, is a positive correlation. This means that as one variable increases, so does the other. For example, the amount of time spent studying and the grade on your test. It could also mean that as one variable goes down, so does the other. The number of calories consumed daily and your weight, those go down together. The variables move together. As long as the variables are moving together, it's a positive correlation. A negative correlation is here. Okay, so as one variable increases, as x increases, y goes down, the other decreases. They move in opposite directions. So if you remember algebra, the graph makes a negative slope. So an example might be the amount of time spent sleeping in class and your final grade. Those should have a negative relationship. The third graph shows no correlation. When graphed together, the variables don't relate to each other at all. This is important to know because in this class or in journal articles, you'll hear variables explained as having a positive or a negative relationship, and you need to know what that means. You may also hear them referred to as direct relationship or inverse relationship. A very important thing to remember is causation versus correlation. This is one of the trickiest concepts, and even seasoned researchers can make this mistake. It is very important to understand the difference between causation and correlation. So causation means that one variable directly caused or led to another, but it can be very hard to prove. Did it really cause it? Did A really cause B? Maybe A causes C, which then causes B. Maybe A interacts with another variable, D, and together they cause B. In psychology especially, causation can be really tricky to establish, and really the only way to do it is with an experiment. A correlation just means variables are related. As A increases, B increases. SAT scores and GPA are correlated, but one does not cause the other. So correlational studies can lead to causation questions, but correlation does not imply causation. Even seasoned researchers can make this mistake. So be wary of any discussions that use cause words. They may not be warranted, especially in the media and the news. The writers usually don't understand the scientific studies, so they'll report a flashy headline such as, "Drinking alcohol may reduce heart disease." But be very careful, because just because two variables are correlated doesn't mean that one caused the other. All right, we will continue this in the next video.